Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I know we're all ready for the semester to be over, but hang in there for a couple more weeks. I think we can do this. As my announcement on Canvas suggested, what I've decided to do with this video is to talk about the cloud of unknowing, of course, but also to both kind of contextualize the cloud and introduce our final two readings. I want to talk a little bit about this sort of broader phenomenon that both the Cloud of Unknowing and Julian and Catherine, who are our next two authors, are a part of. And that phenomenon we've already started to touch on with Eckhart, and it's the explosion of vernacular mystical literature in the late Middle Ages. Eckhart is kind of a border case because he wrote in the vernacular, particularly in his preaching, but also wrote a lot in Latin too. And our final three authors, including the Cloud of Unknowing, are authors who wrote exclusively in the vernacular. And this is really one of the most distinctive marks of the late Middle Ages, is this prolific production of mystical text in the vernacular in not just, one or two European vernacular languages, but in almost any vernacular European language you can think of. Now, this is important in a number of different ways. For one thing, and we'll see this especially the next 2 weeks, the rise of vernacular gives certain women theologians a platform that they would not otherwise have had. We talked about that even with Mechthild. We should not assume, however, that vernacular mystical literature was sort of the exclusive province of women and others who might lack a kind of formal scholastic education. Um, think of Eckhart. Eckhart, obviously, very, very highly educated, but willing to write in the vernacular. Think about the author of The Cloud. We don't know a whole lot about the Cloud author. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But part of what we do know is that he translated several texts from the Latin into Middle English, and that fact alone suggests a fairly high level of formal theological education. So my point is that in the late Middle Ages, it's not as if you would only write in the vernacular if you didn't have the ability to write in Latin. And by the way, this is part of a much larger phenomenon that transcends the boundaries of theology, right? So think about authors like Dante and Chaucer, who were writing around the same time, authors who certainly had the capability of writing in Latin and certainly wanted to write great literature, but believed that it could be done in the vernacular. All right, well, before we get to the Cloud author himself, I just want to talk about some of the broad tendencies of the late medieval vernacular mysticism. These are tendencies that you are not going to find. Any given vernacular mystical author is not going to embody all these tendencies, but these are all quite pervasive in the late Middle Ages. The first point has to do with audience. One of the tendencies we see in this time, especially in vernacular authors, is an attempt to reach a broad audience, not just of clergy or of academics, but lay people as well. And um, this is because there was a kind of growing lay interest in spiritual theology, and authors wanted to meet that need. So on the one hand, you have this broadening of audience. On the other hand, using the vernacular sort of inescapably narrows your audience as well, and means that you're probably thinking more regionally rather than sort of internationally. So, for instance, we know that the works of the Cloud author were not really read much on the European continent. until around really the 20th century, the works of vernacular mystical theology produced in English in the late Middle Ages basically did not have an international audience. They had an almost exclusively English audience until the 20th century. So there's the paradox of widening your audience and also kind of narrowing it in another way. Um, Also, in terms of audience, there is an increased sense that these vernacular mystical theologians are, in a sense, competing with scholastic theologians, who, of course, are writing in Latin, competing with them rather than complementing them. So once we get into the late Middle Ages, we don't see many figures like Bonaventure, right? Someone who was really trying to integrate in something like the Itinerarium, integrate the scholastic and mystical modes of theology. And of course, consider for a moment what our author of the week says about sort of professional theologians. This is on page 260, as always. You want to have your book at hand. And he talks a little bit about theologians and the use of the intellect. And he says, this is just 4 lines down on 260, but the use of it is evil when it is swollen with pride and with a curiosity which comes from the subtle speculation and learning, such as theologians have, which makes them want to be known not as humble clerics and masters of divinity or of devotion, but proud scholars of the devil and masters of vanity and falsehood. So tell us what you really think, Cloud author. So clearly, our author has some real misgivings about sort of the professional academic theologians of his day. Finally, on this question of sort of audience, there's also kind of a widening gap between people who are writing spiritual, mystical theology and sort of the institutional church. Now, remember what I said in my video last week, right? The late Middle Ages is a time of institutional decline and, in fact, institutional crisis in the Western Church. This is the period of the Avignon Papacy, of the Great Schism, and so on. And so the church, the institutional church, is sort of distracted by those kinds of matters during this time and don't really do a whole lot to foster the flourishing of mystical theology. So while in the High Middle Ages, some of the greatest mystical theologians were figures who were very sort of centrally integrated into the institutional church, a Bernard, a Bonaventure, even an Eckhart to a certain extent. That's going to change. In the late Middle Ages, many of the people that we now consider to be some of the great mystical theologians of the period, so the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, Julian of Norwich, these were figures who were very marginal in their own day. They did not make much of an immediate impact. They did not have positions of great authority in the institutional church. So that's another sort of development. And of course, that has implications for audience. So there's not a lot of people in the upper echelons of the church who are reading The Cloud of Unknowing or who are reading Julian of Norwich. And of course, you could not say the same thing about a Bernard or a Bonaventure. All right, so that's audience. I also want to just note some of the recurring theological questions and preoccupations that you can find in much of the vernacular mystical literature of the late Middle Ages. And several of these, although not all, we can find in this week's reading. So, first theological question or preoccupation. How to best relate the active and contemplative lives. We've seen Eckhart take up that question. the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, takes up that question. That is just a pervasive question that virtually all mystical vernacular theologians of the late Middle Ages are going to take up in some way. Secondly, there tends to be a strong fixation on the humanity of Christ in general and of Christ's passion in particular. And there's really negative evidence of this in Eckhart and in The Cloud, because both of those authors seem to be a bit wary, a bit suspicious of those who kind of go overboard with these sort of devotional exercises where you meditate on the passion and of Christ. It's not necessarily that Eckhart and the Cloud author, thinks that it's a bad thing to do that, but it might be wrong to think of that as the be-all and end-all of the spiritual life. So what I'm suggesting is, I think that Eckhart and the author of The Cloud of Unknowing are in many ways reacting against a very widespread emphasis on meditation on the Passion of Christ. Third theological question, or mystical question. This is one that does not really come up in this week's reading. And it has to do with visionary experiences. One of the things that really marks out late medieval spiritual theology is that you're going to run into many authors who claim to have had some kind of visionary experience and to sort of extensively reflect on the theological meaning of that experience. We're going to see this in Julian and Catherine, for instance. And so the question is raised, well, how to discern the spirits when it comes to visionary experience? How to differentiate between legitimate and bogus mystical experiences? And how best to sort of tease out the meaning of those visions? So those become questions that preoccupy a lot of vernacular mystical theologians, though not the one that we're reading this week. Another sort of recurrent theological mystical question: how to relate the cataphatic and apophatic modes of theology. And we don't see that perhaps in a super explicit way in the Cloud author, but I do think the question is there for sure. Another sort of common denominator in late medieval vernacular mysticism is a question that is very much to the fore in this week's reading, and that is how to properly understand the relationship between knowing and loving God in the spiritual life. Are they equally important? Is one more important than the other? Is there a certain sequence involved? Do you have to know God before you love God? Do you have to love God before you know God? How do you parse all that out? And then finally, what you find in much of this mystical literature of the late Middle Ages is reflection on the goal of the contemplative life. What is the goal of mysticism? What is the goal of contemplation? How do we talk about it? Is it best talked about in terms of union? And if so, what kind of union? Is it best thought of in terms of vision, for instance? Okay? So that's going to be another question that sort of percolates through much of this mystical literature. Okay, so that's all just giving you sort of the wide lens view of late medieval vernacular mystical theology. How many adjectives can I cram in there? All right, so to the Cloud. A little background on the Cloud of Unknowing. This is a classic case of a text that has become very famous, at least in certain circles, but for a very long time was an incredibly obscure text. It was not even published, printed, until 1871. Now, since 1871, there have been 9 different English translations in the past century. Just to be clear, it's written in Middle English, which means that for modern English speakers to read it, it has to be translated into modern English. So a little background on the publication of the text. The author, again, we do not know who the author was. I don't really think there's even much speculation as to, like candidates for who the author was. So we can't name the author. Now, there has been speculation that the author was a Carthusian monk. You may remember I briefly mentioned the Carthusians back when I talked about sort of the monastic revolution of the 12th century, which involved the emergence of the Cistercian order and other orders. The Carthusians were an order that, more so than most forms of communal monasticism, really emphasized silence, really emphasized solitude, and emphasized the importance of sort of silent individual prayer. So, in the life of a Carthusian monk, you might spend hours every day simply involved in silent mental prayer. So, you can imagine then why some scholars have at least wondered if our author does not have a Carthusian background, given the kind of contemplation that he is proposing. And of course, I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about that in a moment. Now, what's interesting is that even though we really have no idea who the author of this text is, we do know that he wrote other things, and we have some of those texts, all of them written in vernacular Middle English. Although, again, we know that he had a working knowledge of Latin because of his translation works. Obviously, the author wrote in England. Most scholars think somewhere in the Northeast Midlands, probably sometime around the 1380s or 1390s. So this author was a contemporary of Julian, who's the other English author that we'll be reading for this class. Now, a couple of you raised this in your discussion questions, a question of like, well, who's influencing him and what has this guy read? Well, it's obvious. We know that he read Dennis. We know that he read Bernard because he translated both of them. But interestingly, most scholars think, at least I've not run across a scholar who thinks that he knew Eckhart. And again, that kind of makes sense. Eckhart's most famous writings were in vernacular German, and there's no evidence that our author would be able to read that. So I do think there are some affinities between the Cloud author and Eckhart, but they're pretty different. And certainly in our reading, I can't see any really direct point of influence. Okay, we're just reading a part of the Cloud of Unknowing. I'm sure you noticed that if you happen to notice the chapter titles. We start in chapter 3. It's a fairly large treatise, if we want to call it that. It's written as a long letter. It's written in the form of a letter to a 24-year-old aspiring contemplative, someone who has been living in a great deal of solitude and who is now ready to embark upon the perfect life, the life that we can only sort of begin to anticipate here on earth and that will be fully consummated in heaven. And this, of course, raises the question of the broader audience of this text, a question that a few of you raised in your discussion questions. It's quite clear, and he makes it quite clear, that this is not a book written for anyone and everyone. In the prologue, the author says the book should not be read by or read to anyone except, and this is a quote, by someone or to someone who, as far as you know, has resolved with steadfast determination, truly and sincerely, to be a perfect follower of Christ. And this not only in the active life, but in the contemplative life. So this is written for not just Christians at any old stage of the spiritual life, but those who are at a high level, who are ready to really strive for perfection, contemplative perfection. Now, there's no reason at all, and this I think gets to one of Ellie's questions, there's no reason at all to think that the author is writing only for clerics, only for ordained ministers. He is writing for people with experience in contemplation, but I don't think there's any assumption that only clerics would have such experience. Um, so, um, so that's all in the way of background. I want to focus in my remarks that follow. I want to focus on sort of the exercise that he is advocating. An exercise I think we could describe. He doesn't use this language, but I think we could describe it as contemplative prayer. That's at least how people would talk about it today. Um, that's the exercise. So what can we say about it? And particularly after having read your discussion questions, I decided that maybe the best way to tackle this would be to talk about what contemplative prayer is not for the author of The Cloud. So, first, contemplative prayer, the exercise, is not for our author the sum total of the Christian life. Okay? So he is not saying that this is exclusively what the Christian life is about, contemplative prayer. It is assumed, he assumes quite explicitly, that the person who is ready to take some of the advice that he's giving in this treatise is someone who is already well practiced in the active life. And here we have to remember he has a very interesting way of talking about the relationship between the active and contemplative life, such that each type of life has two stages. So you could say 4 stages in all, but it's really just 3, because the higher stage of the active life and the lower stage of the contemplative life are actually one and the same. Okay, so you can't make super hard and fast boundaries between the active life and the contemplative life. And moreover, there's no suggestion that when one sort of graduates, as it were, to the contemplative life, that you leave the active life behind, that you simply abandon it. He says quite explicitly on page 260, neither of them, that is the active and contemplative lives, neither of them can be lived fully without having some part in the other. So my point is, by attempting this practice of contemplative prayer, in no way is the author saying that you have to abandon the active life. Okay, so want to make that point very clear. And my next point, I think, is related to it. Contemplative prayer, the exercise for our author, is not a permanent state in which one is expected to abide at all times, at least in this life, right? Now, in the life to come, we may be sort of perpetually in this state in a more perfect way. But in this life, it is going to be temporary, though hopefully recurrent. Okay, look at what he says on page 261. I think this is a really important passage to kind of latch onto. This is right in the middle of 261. He says, a man cannot come to the higher part of the contemplative life unless he leaves for a time the lower part. So that for a time is a really important qualification. He's suggesting again that contemplative prayer is something that one might sort of periodically engage in, but it's not a state of being that you can sort of permanently sustain until you die. Okay? And in fact, early on, he makes a big deal of the fact that it is actually an incredibly short exercise that does not require a great deal of your time. So if you want to engage in contemplative prayer, You don't sort of have to say, all right, well, I got to clear my schedule for the entire day. I've got to just sort of focus on contemplative prayer to the exclusion of everything else. No, he says it is the shortest possible of all exercises that men can imagine, and he talks about it being the size of an atom. Now, in the Middle Ages, an atom was actually a measurement of time, and according to medieval reckoning, there were 22,560 atoms in an hour. Okay, so we're talking about like a millisecond, basically. Right? All it takes is a millisecond. Now think about it. If that's the case, then again, it just drives home the point that he's not saying, okay, well, if you want to do contemplative prayer, if you want to do this exercise, you've got to give up on everything else. You've got to give up on performing works of mercy, meditating on the passion of Christ. Can't do that anymore. You have to devote all of your time, all of your energy to this. That's not actually what he's saying. Okay, the point is simply this: that when you are engaging in contemplative prayer, then you have to try to bracket out or sort of put down, suppress all other thoughts. Okay? Thinking about anything other than God, God Himself. Okay? But again, He's not saying, well, now you should no longer think about the lives of the saints. You should no longer perform works of charity. Um, no, it's just when you're engaged in this exercise. All right, here's the third knot. For the author, contemplative prayer is not something over which we have total control. Look at what he says on page 263, top of 263. So lift up your love to that cloud, or rather, if I'm to speak more truthfully, let God draw your love up to that cloud, and try through the help of His grace to forget every other thing. So there's a real dialectic of effort and grace here. On the one hand, we're not going to stumble into contemplative prayer accidentally, right? If we don't sort of resolve to really take a crack at this thing, then it's not going to happen. On the other hand, it's not something we can make happen. It's something that can only happen if God graciously assists us. And what I would suggest, furthermore, is this means that it's not going to be possible for us to engage in this activity simply at the drop of a hat. So this just sort of further underscores my point that the author is not saying that once you get to the point when you're ready for contemplative prayer, then that's all you're going to be doing from that point on. All contemplative prayer all the time. No. And there are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is we don't get to determine ultimately whether we're going to be able to engage in contemplative prayer. Grace is a necessary condition. And God may at times withhold that grace from us. All right, a fourth knot. Contemplative prayer, as it is described by the author here, is not inherently anti-intellectual. Several of you, I think Patrick, maybe Kirk as well, raised concerns about statements by our author that would seem to disparage the intellect, rationality, logic. I think our best parallel here is Bonaventure. Right? Bonaventure says very clearly in the Itinerarium that at the apex of contemplation, right, when you get to that last stage, the intellect can do no more and therefore sort of needs to be powered down. But we saw that for Bonaventure, the intellect was really critical in getting uh, the contemplator to that ultimate point, right? So I think I use this analogy. The intellect is like a ladder, and you need that ladder to get to a certain height. But once you attain that height, you can then kick the ladder away, right? But that doesn't mean that the ladder wasn't important. So just as Bonaventure was not in any way slighting the importance of knowledge, I don't think we should presume that the cloud author is doing that either. I think he simply assumes that the person who is, or at least thinks he or she is prepared for contemplative prayer, has a very firm grasp on the cognitive content of Christian orthodoxy. Okay, a person who is actually ready to engage in contemplative prayer ought to know the ABCs of Christian doctrine very well. I think that is just taken for granted and simply assumed. The point he's trying to make is simply this: when you are ready to arrive at the summit, the apex of the contemplative life, when you think you might be ready to pierce that cloud that separates us from God, uh, only love can carry us that last stretch. Okay? There comes a point at which love outstrips understanding. I mean, just to take an analogy, think about like a movie or a piece of music or a mountain that you love, but cannot intellectually comprehend. In other words, you can't give a full, satisfactory, and adequate intellectual account for why you love those things in the way that you do, or why you find those things so beautiful, so lovable, so desirable. And it would only be counterproductive to try to offer a kind of a rational account for why you love your spouse the way you do, or why you love a piece of art the way you do. Um, that's sort of what he's talking about, right? There is a point at which um, love sort of completes the work of understanding. Okay? So that's one point, that we shouldn't assume that for him the intellect has no role in the spiritual life at all. He's just talking about the highest level of the spiritual life. But furthermore, he actually gives a rational account of why the intellect can be dangerous when we're engaged in contemplative prayer. Our intellects, and this is basically an Aristotelian point, our intellects rely on our imagination. Okay? And our imagination is limited to our experience of earthly creatures, creatures that we can experience with our senses. And because we can experience them with our senses, we can come to know them. Okay? And our imaginations are sort of stocked accordingly. So, yeah, we can imagine things that don't exist, like a unicorn, but we can only imagine those things because we've seen and experienced with our senses the component parts of a unicorn. So we can imagine a horse because we've experienced a horse with our senses. We can imagine a horn because we've experienced horns with our senses. And so our imagination simply assembles those images and creates this sort of non existent thing. So, if we try to use our intellect to understand God, we're going to end up drawing on our imagination, which means we're going to end up trying to use our earthly experience and extrapolate that into experience of God. So that we'll end up thinking about something that is not really God, but rather a product of our imagination. And this is where you can really see the kind of apophatic aspect of the cloud, right? We saw this concern going all the way back to Dennis, the godfather of apophatic theology, right? That there is a real danger when we try to use our intellect to understand or explain God, because our intellect is reliant on categories that come from our finite creaturely experience. Okay. So, again, notice what he's doing. He's giving a rational account for the limitations of rationality. Right? So it's a kind of paradox, but I don't think it's a contradiction nonetheless. All right, I want to come to my last point. And this is not a not. I want to end on a positive note. I want to raise the really important question, which Andrea, among maybe some others, raised, which is, what is the goal of the exercise? Right? What is the goal exactly of contemplative prayer? I think the goal ultimately is union with God, but union in the vein more of Bernard than in the vein of Eckhart. If you look at page 261, look at the end of that first full paragraph. Okay? He is above himself because he makes it his purpose to arrive by grace whither he cannot come by nature. That is to say, to be knit to God in spirit, in oneness of love and union of will. So oneness, union, being knit together. But what kind of union? As we've seen, that's an important question to ask. There's union and then there's union. There's Bernard's union and then there's Eckhart's union. And clearly, this talk of the union of wills puts the Cloud author much more firmly in Bernard's camp. Okay, so there is going to be an abiding, eternal distinction between ourselves and God, but we can achieve this oneness of God and union of wills. And one last discussion question that I read that I wanted to address because I think it has a bearing on this. Emily asked a really good question. She pointed at a couple of passages in the reading. One passage, the author says very emphatically that we must stay put in the cloud of unknowing, the cloud of darkness. And then there's another passage where he talks about trying to break through that cloud, trying to pierce that cloud. So what do we make of this? Is it the goal for our author to leave the cloud of unknowing, right? Because that's the question I just posed. What is the goal of this exercise? Is the goal to leave the cloud of unknowing behind? I think the answer has to be no. And here's why. Because the cloud of unknowing, this cloud of darkness, is the necessary result of the ontological gap between God and us, right? We're creatures. God is the creator. God is infinite. We are finite. There is nothing that could ever happen that would reverse that would close that gap. So it's very important to note, and I think somebody asked about this too, that this cloud of darkness or unknowing, it doesn't really have anything to do with human sin. Notice, at least in our reading, there's not a lot of talk about sin. The cloud of darkness, the cloud of unknowing, is, again, the necessary outcome of the infinite dissimilarity between God and creatures. And therefore, it would be arrogant, if not absolutely lunatic, to think that we could ever transcend the cloud. And perhaps if our author had ever read Eckhart, he might make that precise critique of the good Meister. But, and this is a really important but, we can, in a way, still reach out across that gap to God with love. It doesn't mean that the gap disappears, but it does mean that gap can be bridged in a certain way when we reach out to God with love. So if If you look at page 257, um, this is towards the end of chapter 6. You were to step above it stalwartly but lovingly, and with a devout, pleasing, impulsive love, strive to pierce that darkness above you. You were to smite upon that thick cloud of unknowing with a sharp dart of longing love. Okay? So the cloud is pierced, but it's not pierced by our intellect, by our understanding, but by love. And while it is pierced, it is not dispelled. The cloud does not simply disappear because our ontological condition remains the same, right? We are and always will be creatures. God is and always will be the infinite creator, okay? But love makes it possible for us to embrace God, right? Look at page 254. This is another passage where he tries to deal with this paradox of being able to comprehend the incomprehensible God. He says, and our soul, because of his reforming grace, is wholly enabled to comprehend by love, not intellect, but by love, the whole of him who is incomprehensible to every created knowing power. So love allows us to comprehend the incomprehensible. Notice love doesn't make the incomprehensible God magically comprehensible to our minds, but we can comprehend, or again, we might say embrace God with our love. And this is what he calls the everlastingly wonderful miracle of love. Love allows us to comprehend the incomprehensible in such a way that God still remains eternally incomprehensible to our minds. Okay? So I think that's what he's getting at when he talks about always remaining in the cloud, which is an act of humility, an acknowledgement that our intellect will never be able to grasp God. But nonetheless, that cloud in which we will always abide can be pierced through this sort of stirring or stabbing of love. All right, I'm just going to stop.